So before I do the official introduction for Bruce, I want to thank him for a couple of things. I want to thank him for being here, for being willing to be on a program and share his really deep wisdom about everything with us. And Bruce is a Vietnam era Air Force veteran. He became a peace activist while he was in the military and began his organizing career, which has not stopped since then, by working for the United Farm Workers Union in Florida, organizing fruit pickers. Between 1883 and 1998, Bruce was the state coordinator for the Florida Coalition for Peace and Justice, and he has worked on space issues, war in space, for over 40 years. In 1987, he organized the largest peace protest in Florida history when over 5,000 people marched on Cape Canaveral in opposition to the first flight test of the Trident II nuclear missile. Bruce was the organizer also of the Cancel Cassini campaign. Many of you will probably remember that, when NASA launched 72 pounds of very dangerous plutonium into space in 1997. That drew enormous support and media coverage around the world. Bruce has traveled and spoken in too many countries to name, but you can read it, as well as many college campuses. He's been featured by artist Robert Shettley in Shettley's collection of portraits and quotes entitled Americans Who Tell the Truth. In 2006, he was the recipient of Dr. Benjamin Spock Peacemaker Award, and he initiated the main campaign to bring our war dollars home in 2009. And it goes on and goes on. His articles have appeared in publications, many publications. You can read that. I'm not going to name them all. And he's produced documentary videos. He produced a popular documentary entitled Arsenal of Hypocrisy that spelled out U.S. plans for space domination. In 2010, he was extensively figured in the award-winning documentary called Pax Americana and the Weaponization of Space. He has worked to help build support for the Jeju Island issue for many years. He was featured in a documentary video called The Ghost of Jeju, which you can still see. The Ghost of Jeju, it's about a South Korean village fighting against construction of a Navy base. And with that, I want to also thank Bruce for inspiring, actually being the initial inspiration for all the Veterans for Peace overseas delegations that I have been involved in, and have been quite a few, because he is the one who originally asked myself, Elliot Adams, and Mike Hasty to come to Jeju Island and stand there. And it went on from there. Jeju Island, and it was numerous delegations to Okinawa to stand with the people there, and so on and so forth. Palestine, Standing Rock. So, Bruce, I want to thank you for that initial inspiration. A lot has come from it. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Bruce. And once again, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Tarek. Those words mean a lot to me. Thank you, Ellen, as well. And thank you all for being here this evening. I'm going to share my screen. Can you all see that? Okay.
Yes, looks good.
Yes.
In 1982, there was a special session on disarmament in New York City at the UN. Almost 1 million people protesting there against nuclear weapons. I was watching it on C-SPAN, living at the time in Orlando, Florida. And they showed the rally, the speakers, and then the march. Probably some of you were there that day. And afterwards on C-SPAN, they cut away to a right-wing conference, and the speaker was Ronald Reagan's head of SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars. And in the Q&A, somebody said to him, General Graham, they say there's almost 1 million people in New York today protesting against nuclear weapons. Are you worried about that? And he said, no, I think it's fantastic because they're out there protesting against nuclear weapons and we're moving into space and they don't have a clue. Let them keep doing what they're doing. And it was literally in that moment, June 12th, 1982, that I started working on space issues. I've been doing it ever since. The document on the left, U.S. Space Command Vision for 2020, created in 1997. Inside, it says the U.S. will control space, dominate space, and deny other nations access to space. U.S. will be the master of space. The picture on the right is the Space Command headquarters at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs. Today, all warfare on the Earth is coordinated by space technology. Whether you're a troop on the ground in a tank, you're in a plane, you're in a boat in the Navy, everything is coordinated by space technology. So whoever controls space literally has the advantage, the high ground, to control the Earth below as well. And this is why we see today so much competition for space. So the US now has what are called downlink or ground stations all over the world. On the left is in the high north of Sweden. On the right is a successor to the space shuttle, the X-37, a super drone that has shown it can stay in orbit for a year at a time. And when the Space Command has war games every year, a computer war game, where they practice what they call the red team versus the blue team, a US first strike attack on Russia and China, the first weapon they use is the X-37 military space plane that drops down from orbit, drops an attack on Russia and China. They have many of them there now they're building, and then goes back up into space again. On the left is Jeju Island in South Korea, our friends there. And now they're facing not only the Navy base that was forced upon them at the demand of the United States, who wants more ports that they can move their ships into the Asia Pacific as part of this Asia pivot, but now they're turning Jeju Island into a space satellite production and launch facility. So they're militarizing Jeju even further than previously. On the right is a picture just from a couple of weeks ago when we had Keep Space for Peace Week in early October. Some of our friends in England went to the Ministry of Defense in London protesting against all kinds of developments inside of the United Kingdom, launch facilities, radar facilities, other kinds of technologies that are linked to the US military space program. This upper left picture is from my friends in Albuquerque, New Mexico, where Kirtland Air Force Base specializes in creating directed energy weapons. And today they're building a $1 billion beam weapon for Israel to use against Palestine and other nations in the Middle East. Kirtland is working on ground-based lasers. You see in the picture on the left, they fire a beam from the laser into space in order to knock out other countries' satellites. Call that an anti-satellite weapon. For years, they've been working on the lower right, orbiting battle stations in space. They would fire a laser beam into space to destroy satellites or even to the Earth to hit ground targets below. In Norway, I don't know if you can see it because of the pictures of all of us are on the right. If I lower mine, I can see it. just right on the uh, Norway-Russia border is a place called Vardo. That's the picture on the left. It's a early warning command center for the United States as it prepares for a first strike attack against Russia. And from this early warning center, they would, number one, detect how Russia was responding, but also help guide attacks onto Russia. This is on the left, a base in Poland that just opened in recent weeks. It's been under construction for some years. The Navy Aegis destroyers that are made in Bath, Maine, right next door to where I live, on board have interceptor missiles. And they also have first strike attack Tomahawk cruise missiles. So they have the sword, the cruise missile, the first strike sword, and then they have what they call missile defense system, the shield, to be used in US first strike attack planning. Because they've had the best testing of any of the various missile defense systems, many of which haven't shown to be very effective, they decided to put it on land in Poland and Romania, and they call it Aegis Ashore. So from this place, the United States would be able to launch first strike attack cruise missiles that would reach Russia in a matter of literally minutes. And then when Russia fired a retaliatory strike, the so-called shield, the missile defense system, would theoretically take out the Russian response. This is, of course, a provocative installation. People in America don't know anything about it, of course. And most importantly, it's a Cuban Missile Crisis in reverse. On the right is a list of nations throughout Europe that now host, or in the case of RAF Lakenheath in England, will soon be hosting US nuclear missiles that would be flown on F-35 fighter bombers. So the US has nuclear weapons in Europe, and they are constantly wargaming attacks on Russia from these bases. Even here in Maine, where I live, they're now talking about building a hypersonic testing site up in northern Maine at former Loring Air Force Base that's been closed down. And also the U.S. Space Command is contracting with a satellite company here in my town, Brunswick, Maine, to build small nano satellites to be launched into lower Earth orbit on behalf of the Space Force. And I'll get to that a little more detail in a moment. For the last 2 years in Portland, they've had a Maine Space Conference as they're trying to now bring this industry into our state, as they're trying to do to many other states and have already done to many other states around the country. The promises are always the same: lots of jobs, no real environmental impact, and it will always be civilian. But as we learned in Kodiak Island, Alaska, where Israel has tested their Arrow missile defense system from Kodiak, which was in its days when it was sold to the people of Alaska as a civilian launch facility, it's been nothing but military launches. And that's the same story repeated everywhere you go. Let's talk about the origins of the US space program. At the end of World War II, the United States smuggled about 1,500 Nazi operatives into the US, 100 of which were Wernher von Braun and his rocket team that built the V1 and V2 rockets in Germany during the war that were used to terrorize the cities of London and Brussels and other European cities towards the end of the war as Hitler was losing the war. This book on the left, I highly recommend it. It's an intense and detailed description of this entire Operation Paperclip. But in addition to the rocket scientists, they brought in the guys that did the MK Ultra drug experiments, the Nazi scientists that did those. They brought in Nazi scientists that were putting prisoners of war and slaves, mostly Jews and gypsies. They were putting them in freezing temperatures to find out how down pilots, their bodies would react. They called that space medicine. They were sent to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio to create the U.S. flight medicine program. And then a guy named Galen, Reinhold Galen, Hitler's head of military intelligence in Eastern Europe, right up against the Russian border. He was brought to the US, helped create the CIA, turned over his rat line, his contacts throughout Eastern Europe to the US, that the US then used during the Cold War to destabilize Russia and to make Stalin paranoid in those years following World War II, because he knew the US was using these former Nazi sympathizers throughout Eastern Europe to destabilize the Soviet Union. So back in Germany, this is upper left is Werner von Braun with a bunch of Nazis. And on the right is the mountain tunnel called Dora, where they brought in tens of thousands of slaves, Jews, gypsies, French resistance fighters, prisoners of war. And their job was to build the V-2 rockets for Hitler, which were then tested and then used in battle. Now, some of them began failing, and they suspected that some people were sabotaging them. So they rounded up 100 of the slaves and summarily hung them in front of everyone else. Von Braun was constantly begging the operatives above him for more slaves to be brought to this place because they were starving them to death as they were working them in these terrible conditions, and they were dying rapidly. So they constantly had to replenish those people. Von Braun was in the middle of that whole operation. The upper left is the 100 rocket scientists that first came to White Sands in New Mexico and then moved on to Huntsville, Alabama. And a picture on the right is von Braun and some of his Nazi scientists and engineers with their US military overseer who was watching and coordinating everything about that they did. On the left is Dornberger, Walter Dornberger, Major General, who was Hitler's liaison to von Braun during the operation, during the construction of the V-1 and V-2 rockets. Dornberger came to the US during Operation Paperclip and became a vice president of Bell Aerospace in New York State. And during the 1950s, he testified before the Congress of the United States saying, "Gentlemen, I didn't come to this country to lose the Third World War. I lost two already." And he was the prime visionary, if I can use that word, of orbiting battle stations, US controlling the pathway on and off the planet Earth on behalf of the military and ultimately space mining in the future. So these are the origins of the US space program. And I like to ask the question, when you seed the military industrial complex with 1,500 of the top Nazi operatives, was there an ideological contamination that came along with them? Years ago, in Jane's Defense Weekly, one of the writers for that publication, very famous military aerospace publication, he wrote that the US black budget was actually brought over during Operation Paperclip. It was a Nazi program in Germany. So today, the goal is to fill up lower Earth orbit because whoever controls it has an advantage, being able to see the planet below, being able to intercept all phone, fax, email communications, be able to target the planet for attack, and then be able to direct attacks on the Earth as well from space using space technology. Well, the orbits are becoming crowded, much like a grocery store parking lot. There's a limited number of parking spaces in lower Earth orbit. And so today, many fear what's called the Kessler syndrome. And there's a NASA scientist by the name of Kessler that created this idea of a syndrome, cascading collisions, because things get so crowded up there in lower Earth orbit that soon you just have nothing but a field of debris, everything smashing into everything else, satellites being destroyed one after the other. And soon much of what we do on the Earth goes dark because so many of the things that we use today, GPS and uh, internet banking and air traffic control and many other things are hooked up via satellites. So if we have a war in space or if we continue this crowding situation, the Kessler syndrome strikes and we have big problems. In 1989, I organized another protest at the Space Center in Florida, and Apollo astronaut Edgar Mitchell came and spoke. He was one of the early moonwalkers, and he said, if we have one war in space, it'll be the one and only, because we'll create so much space debris that we will be entombed to the planet forever. Every time the US and other countries do launches, come to find out there's massive tons of carbon dioxide that move into the upper atmosphere that are punching a greater hole in the ozone layer. So we hear a lot of these launches that are sold to us as civilian launches. They say that actually they're going up to study climate change. They're going up to study the ozone layer. But in fact, these launches are punching a hole, a greater hole in the ozone. For about 30 years or so, Russia and China have been going to the United Nations General Assembly and introducing a resolution to ban all weapons in space. It's called PAROS, Prevention of an Arms Race in Outer Space. The idea is that we want to close the door to the barn before the horse gets out. But the US has been opposing the development of this treaty. But at the General Assembly every year, they take a vote, a non-binding vote, and it passes overwhelmingly, except for the US and Israel, and sometimes the Marshall Islands, because they have to stay in US's pocket if they want more funding to help deal with the massive cancers they have from the US A-bomb and H-bomb tests in the islands there. And then lately, Ukraine has also been voting against this. Zelensky also being in the pocket of the United States. But because it passes overwhelmingly, the UN sends it to Geneva to the Permanent Conference on Disarmament for negotiation. And there again, the US and Israel are blocking the treaty. So it's going nowhere. And this is during Republican and Democrat administrations in the United States. And every time the US always says, hey, we don't need a treaty to ban weapons in space. There's no problem. We don't have any weapons in space. Don't worry about it. Let's just have a non-binding rules of the road and leave it at that. On the left is Foreign Policy Magazine. Washington must prepare for war with both Russia and China. Foreign policy, of course, is the arm of the Council on Foreign Relations, the deep state. And on the right is the Rand Corporation, which you know is funded by the Pentagon. This is where Daniel Ellsberg famously worked and copied the secret history of the Vietnam War, the Pentagon Papers, and smuggled it out to the New York Times and other papers across the country. And in this study in 2019 by Rand Corporation, they talk about the need to extend and unbalance Russia in order to create regime change. Now, why does the United States want regime change with Russia? It's because I believe because of climate change. Russia has the largest land border with the Arctic Ocean of any country on Earth. And the Western resource extraction corporations want to drill, baby, drill up in that region. But again, with Russia's long border, it makes it difficult for them. I checked a year or so ago, how many times has Russia been invaded by the West? As it turns out, over the last 600 years, Sweden has invaded Russia 10 times. As you know, Napoleon, representing France, invaded Russia and lost. Of course, Hitler from Germany invaded Russia. And now we have the invasion by US NATO today, trying to take out Russia, to break it up into smaller countries, Yugoslavia 2.0, if you will, bust up Russia into smaller countries so that the Western resource extraction corporations can grab the border and all the resources of Russia. As it turns out, the US Navy has been studying this proposition for a long time. And the US and NATO now are doing war games up in the frozen north, up in the Arctic region regularly. Notice the date on this study on the left, 2014. That was the year the US, under Obama-Biden administration, they did the coup d'etat. They orchestrated the coup d'etat in Kiev and installed the Nazis that took over the security and internal security, intelligence, military agencies of Ukraine. This woman on the right, her name is Kaja Kallas. She was recently Estonia's prime minister. She hates Russia. She says that Russia should be broken up into smaller countries. And on the left is a map that has been circulating amongst NATO allies for quite a while, where they're envisioning this breakup of Russia into these smaller nations. Kaja Kallas, as it turns out, just left her job as Prime Minister of Estonia, and now she's the European Union's foreign policy leader. So she'll be in that position, continuing this war on Russia, using Ukraine as a proxy as long as they can keep it going. This is Bill Clinton doing what he called NATO enhancement during his administration. You might recognize some of the people in the picture. Joe Biden right behind Al Gore there, Madeleine Albright, and a bunch of other neocons in the picture as well. And this violated the promise that was made to Mikhail Gorbachev at the time of the collapse of the former Soviet Union. Germany wanted to reunite East and West. East was controlled by the Soviet Union. West was, of course, controlled by the West. And the only thing Gorbachev asked for was that NATO never expand eastward, or eastward into toward the Soviet Union. And at that time, Secretary of State Jim Baker, working for George W. Bush, promised that NATO will never expand 1 inch towards Russia. Of course, that turned out to be a broken promise with Clinton. And so today we now see that since Clinton's time, NATO has expanded into Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania. Now they want to get into Ukraine. They want to get into Georgia. And it's just on steroids. And Russia has repeatedly said, Ukraine is a red line. You cannot bring NATO into Ukraine. It would be the equivalent of the United States putting military bases, Russia and China putting military bases in Mexico and Canada right along the US border. Washington would go ballistic. And as these NATO nations have expanded eastward, so have the war games that are annually held by US and NATO, both on the land and on the picture on the right in the oceans, moving up towards the Arctic region. And when the US sends equipment over to Europe for these US NATO war games, they leave it afterwards in, in depots that have been created. The one on the right is a weapons hub in Poland, where the US stores military equipment. And on the left is in Norway, inside a tunnel, a mountain tunnel in Norway. The US stores this equipment in preparation for war with Russia. Well, this is a hot issue now. Biden has just given authorization for long-range missiles, ATACMS, with a range of 190 miles to be fired into Russia proper. And yesterday, they were fired into Kursk, the region, a Russian province, where the NATO had Zelensky send in tens of thousands of troops to try to literally invade Russia. So far, 30,000 Ukrainian troops have been killed there. They sent in their very best troops. They pulled them out of the Donbass region where the fighting has been going on since February of 2022. They pulled their top people out of there and sent them into Russia proper, where they're being killed daily. And now, just yesterday, we heard that Britain has given permission for the Storm Shadow cruise missiles, first strike attack missiles, to also be used against Russia. And they were fired into Bryansk, another Russian province that borders both Kursk and Bryansk border Ukraine. And so they sent in, Ukraine launched these Storm Shadow missiles yesterday into there. They have a range of more than 550 kilometers. They'd be able to reach Moscow and other places inside of Russia. These Storm Shadows were fired at Crimea. They tried to take out the Crimean bridge that links Russia mainland with Crimea. As a result of that, Putin has said he's just signed a new nuclear policy that says anytime there is an existential threat against Russia by Ukraine and its allies, NATO allies, they reserve the right to use nuclear weapons. Now, it should be noted that Ukraine cannot fire these ATACMS and these Storm Shadow long-range missiles because they don't have satellites. They don't have ground stations that coordinate space, these attacks via space technology. And so the US and NATO have troops on the ground inside of Ukraine where they man the launchers and they have people working the computers hooked up to the satellites, identifying the targets, directing these missiles to those targets. Russia knows all about it. And so these US NATO troops inside of Ukraine that are firing these long-range missiles, as far as Russia considers, means that NATO is at war with Russia. On the left is Alex Soros, the son of George Soros, who was instrumental in helping to fund the 2014 coup d'etat in Kiev that installed the Nazis into that government. He's saying this is great news, that these weapons can now be used. And surprisingly, Donald Trump Jr. on the right, you'll see, he says the military-industrial complex seems to want to make sure that they get World War III going before my father has a chance to create peace and save lives. Got to lock in those trillions. Now, I don't know if Trump is serious about all this, but it was impressive to see that tweet by Donald Trump Jr. You got to hope it means something real. I just found this graph on the left done by Gallup polling company that says today 52% of Ukrainians want the war to end. But the EU and Ukraine are not independent agents anymore. They are puppets of the United States of America. And as a result of this, especially in the case of Germany, after the Nord Stream pipeline was blown up, according to Seymour Hersh, by the Biden administration, that took cheap natural gas from Russia to Germany, German economy is crashing because they no longer have access to this cheap Russian natural gas. Their auto industry, in particular, is crashing day by the day. At the same time, the U.S. plans to move NATO into the Asia Pacific. And on the left, you see the current bases throughout the region of the Asia Pacific that the U.S. has, and more are being built daily. This picture on the right, to me, is a mind blower. We know the U.S. has troops in Taiwan. We know the U.S. has been arming Taiwan. But little do we know, look at this red dot, this red arrow or stick pin on the left. In China, Guangzhou, 3 kilometers from Guangzhou is the Kinmen Islands, and the U.S. today has military troops there. Talk about right up on China's border. And then just below that, the Penghu Islands, the U.S. also has troops there as well. So the U.S. is so aggressive now. And sadly, most American people, and even unbelievably many people in the peace movement, know very little about these current trends. This photo on the left shows you the island chain where the U.S. is militarizing throughout the Okinawa and all these other islands around Taiwan, the Sakishima Islands. The U.S. is building, along with Japan, building military rocket launch facilities in many of these places that would be used in an attack on China. And so the people of Okinawa, they're very clear about it. They know about this stuff, but sadly, not everyone in Japan gets the full picture. We owe a lot of thanks to our friend Rachel Clark, who's been taking VFP delegations to Japan for several years now, helping people learn more about all these plans. I saw that one of my friends from Maine is on this call today, Cynthia Howard. That's her holding this banner in Portland in a few winters ago. Remember, a nuclear war is a terminal war. We're done, finished. Thank you all for listening.
Wow, Bruce, thank you so much for it's tough material to absorb, but it's truthful, and it's so important that we're all aware of it. It's actually a very difficult consciousness raising. So thank you. I think we'll open it up for questions, comments, if you could keep them short, and mainly do questions and let Bruce answer. Because a lot must have come up during this talk. And Bruce always gives details that many of us, even activists who follow things, don't know or are not aware of. So again, thanks, Bruce. Um,
There's a question in the chat from Kuhan saying, when the space shuttle vehicle drops down into the atmosphere to attack, what does that attack actually look like?
I'm sorry, can you say that again, please? I was
When the
reading the,
space when the space shuttle vehicle drops down into the atmosphere to attack, what does that attack actually look like?
well, I learned about it reading an article some years ago in Aviation Week and Space Technology magazine. They reported on the computer war game sitting at the terminal, the people running the computer war game, and next to them was a military lawyer. And they turned to the lawyer and they said, would using this military space plane, the X-37, violate the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which bans weapons of mass destruction in space? And the lawyer said, no, it would not, because the X-37 is a weapon of selective destruction and falls outside of the Outer Space Treaty that ban weapons of mass destruction. And so this is what the U.S. is, why they fear getting a new treaty that would ban all weapons in space, because right now there's a hole in the Outer Space Treaty that they can use. So the X-37, it's supposedly top secret. Nobody's supposed to know what it carries on board, but many people believe that they could carry nuclear weapons. They could uh, drop other kinds of weapons that maybe we don't even know about, but that it would be one of the first weapons to be used. Following that, other weapon systems that are under development, I'm sure that are top secret that we don't know about, could be used. One of them, for example, I don't think it's been successfully tested yet. They call it rods from God, an orbiting battle station with tungsten steel rods that would drop down from space, gather speed as they came, and be used in first strike attacks. And at the same time, missiles would be launched from around the world. I think many of the new uh, launch facilities that are being produced by the U.S. and its allies around the globe uh, could launch missiles at Russia and China in a first strike attack, nuclear bombers, submarines. So a whole slew of weapon systems, both from space and from terrestrial operations, would be used.
Ellen, are you watching the chat?
I
There's
am. I have a couple more interesting questions. Cleo asks if it's okay to share the map showing the U.S. bases off of China. Should she? I'm sure you wouldn't mind that, right?
No, sure.
Okay. Mary Finneran says, this is, I think, interesting. Do you see a relationship between space weapons and Musk?
It's a good question. You notice during the campaign, when Musk was campaigning for Trump, he was wearing a T-shirt that said "Occupy Mars." I don't know if you ever saw that, but he wore it a lot. One of his goals is to terraform Mars, to make Mars green like the planet Earth. And to do that, he wants to explode 1,000 nuclear bombs over Mars in the Martian atmosphere in order to heat the planet up, to make it green. Now, he says he wants to move our civilization to Mars, but the truth of the matter is they want to mine Mars. They want to mine the various planetary bodies. And to do that, they need a lot of money. And one way to get it is, in Trump's case, is to ingratiate himself with Donald Trump, to work in a department to cut various budgets of various federal agencies, maybe cut Social Security, maybe cut Medicare, Medicaid. You know, years ago in another industry publication, aerospace industry publication called Space News, they had an editorial that said we have to be responsible corporate citizens and come up with a dedicated funding source in order to pay for our everything space agenda. And we have. We're now sending our lobbyists to Washington to secure that funding source. And they called it the entitlement programs that officially are Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and what's left of the tattered welfare program. So I think it's pretty clear that Musk has a real agenda to benefit himself. At the same time, there's a movement underway now to force the FCC, which is in charge of approving all launches from the United States into lower Earth orbit, which I told you before is becoming increasingly crowded. Musk wants to launch somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 more satellites into space, and he has to get approval from the FCC. So another reason I think for him to be getting into the government, because increasingly astronomers are saying that his Starlink satellites are creating such a bright sky that astronomers can't do their work anymore. They're losing the dark night. And other people, environmentalists, peace people, the Global Network, for example, we're all working now to put together a coalition to force the FCC to crack down on people like Musk. At the same time, they're trying to keep Russia and China out of lower Earth orbit. And that's why the US is rushing to fill it up before Russia and China can get up there in any serious numbers.
Ellen,
I had a comment.
Alice has her hand up.
Right,
No,
right.
I'm on the board of World Beyond War, and we were looking at a lot of the things you're talking about, Bruce. And we think we could start a peace movement of telling Musk where to cut the budget. They want to be efficient, right? I mean, we could start a whole new dialogue, create a meme like the 99% and the one. You want to cut the budget, you want to be efficient. Why do we need $1 trillion on new nuclear weapons? We have enough old ones, that kind of thing. We could go down every single weapon system and say why we have enough and we couldn't possibly do more. And that's something to think about. Like if we could get like a peace meme walking into this Musk thing, he's efficiency. They're going to figure out where to save money in the government. Duh, where do we save money? I mean, it's all being wasted on the military. So I'm just putting it out there. We need a brainstorm of how we're going to make this a very powerful message.
I think it's a good idea. Yeah, very good idea.
And thanks to you, fabulous. I mean, it's everything.
Thanks,
it's
Alice.
everything you never wanted to know about what's going on.
That's right.
There's a couple more questions in the chat. There's one about how involved are German Nazis in the current U.S. government? I suspect the ones that came over in paperclip are dead by now, but
I would venture a guess that in Huntsville, Alabama, that they call it there the Pentagon of the South, that there's probably a lot of children and grandchildren from these Nazi scientists that are working inside of the industry today. And they have a Southern accent. They don't have a German accent.
And then we have a question from Jerry who says that, well, it's certainly true that most people, including even peace activists, are unaware of the aggressive U.S. moves, but certainly Russia, China, and other nations are aware. And how are they responding?
Well, since the U.S. came out with so-called missile defense, the shield to be used to theoretically knock out Russian or Chinese retaliatory strikes after the U.S. sword, first strike, lunges into the heart of Russia and China, trying to take out their nuclear capability. Since the U.S. came out with missile defense, Russia and China said publicly, repeatedly, that we're not going to be able to get rid of our nuclear weapons as long as you are developing the capability to take out our nuclear weapons, either in a first strike or in a retaliatory strike when we launch them with your missile defense systems. And so they both have long said we'd rather be spending our money on the development of our country, ending poverty, et cetera, et cetera. But we're not able to do that because we know you have a first strike attack program that you're developing, both technologically and strategically, ideologically. And we can't let you get away with that. The survival of our nation, of our two nations, is incumbent on us not to get rid of our nuclear weapons under this circumstance. I've said to many of my friends who particularly work on nuclear weapons issues, that they needed to make this link to U.S. First strike attack planning and missile defense systems and everything else. It was the obstacle to having successful nuclear disarmament. But very few ever really responded to that plea.
Eric, you have your hand up. You're the MC. You can talk.
Well, Bruce, so much of what you've detailed and other things that are going on, all the news that we're getting, makes me feel that we're up the creek basically without a paddle. But what I want to ask you, and I know that there are things that you do almost every day and every week to expose and to resist some of this weaponization and militarization that's going on in Maine and other places. So I appreciate that. But what else is there that you see going on that is possible in this country, other countries, BRICS, what have you, that has a chance of stopping this juggernaut that's heading us all towards oblivion? So I'd like you to speak about that a little bit, so it's a little more.
I'm glad you raised BRICS. Very important. BRICS, BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And now they call it BRICS Plus because there's a whole slew of other countries. They say 40 some countries are lined up to join it. It's essentially an alternative economic institution, alternative to the exploitative IMF and World Bank. This is a global South institution. So after 600 years of Western colonial control and occupation of the global South, they're now standing up only, I believe, primarily, I shouldn't say only, but primarily because Russia and China are backing them. I don't believe that many of these global South countries, whether it's Nicaragua or Venezuela or Niger or Mali or Iran or many other countries around the world, would be able to stand up the way they are today without the strong support from Russia and China. And of course, this really pisses off the West, doesn't it? So not only is Russia and China a problem for them, they're two big, enemies that they want to go to war with, and they keep repeating it publicly. But now they got this problem of this institution called BRICS. I put an article on my blog the other day by a Russian political scientist who said Trump wants to kind of get rid of the Ukraine proxy war problem, and he wants to really go after BRICS because it's the real threat to Western domination and control. The West is terrified. They're desperate because when you join BRICS, you de-dollarize. You stop using the dollar, which has been running the global economy for years, right? And so suddenly, U.S. is in big trouble, and its allies too. And so I think this is the real issue. So I think number one, if you don't know about BRICS, you got to learn about it. And number two, you got to teach other people in the peace movement about BRICS and what it means and why it exists and why it's such a danger to the West and why the West is so eager and so crazy to destroy it. So I think that's a real key um, right now. And the other thing I've been saying for 30 years or more, if you want to help stop Star Wars, which the Pentagon and the aerospace industry has long bragged will be the largest industrial project in the history of the planet Earth. So if you want to help stop Star Wars, stop war in space, war from space to the Earth, fight for social progress, fight for environmental funding, because you can't have both. It's going to be one or the other. But as you're fighting for social progress, talk about space. Talk about all the money that's being wasted. Talk about how the aerospace industry views it as the gold mine that they have to control.
Thanks again, Bruce. I want to encourage people. Bruce has a great uh, blog spot. It's called,
Link is in the chat.
that's what I was going to say, Alan, because you just put it there. I thought it was very good on your part. But I just want to encourage people to look at it, click on that link so you can go to it's excellent. It's really excellent. And that'll allow you to keep up with a lot of Bruce's thinking, which is very valuable, as we all see. So, unless we have any more serious questions, does anyone have any essential questions? We're going to let Bruce go. We're going to thank him. I want to, you can all, why don't you all unmute yourself, Alan? Unmute people, please.
They have to unmute themselves.
Oh,
I don't.
unmute yourselves because I want to give Bruce a really big hand of appreciation for all he does and what he's done tonight.
Thank you.
And thank you all. Thank you all for all you do. Keep at
Thank
it.
you.
As I like to
Yes.
say, as I like
This
to
has
say
been the
these
best.
days, I like to say, keep paddling.
Very good. We will.
Bruce, can I ask a quick question? This is Peter
Sure.
Phillips. Hey, Scott Ritter yesterday was talking about the ATACMS, and in the paper today, there's been reports that Ukraine is using ATACMS to, into Russia. Nothing mentioned that it's U.S. managed. Ritter was saying that it may not be active personnel; it may be contractors, but we don't know. But it definitely is U.S. managed. So that I wanted to make that point. I think we should be making it widely.
Yeah. Sometimes what they do is they kind of semi-retire a military operative and they dress him up in civilian clothes. And then he goes to Ukraine and he works as a quote unquote contractor, as you said. And then after his time there, however long it might be, he goes back and they bring him back into the military again. And he gets time served. You know what I mean? He gets credit for time served as a contractor. So they do that. They do all kinds of tricks to hide these active duty military people in Ukraine.
Okay. Any last words, Bruce, or pretty much
Just
said it?
thank you all for inviting me, and thank you everybody for coming on and hearing me out, and thank you all again for everything you do. And when you add it up, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of things you're doing. You're reaching a lot of people. So don't ever forget that. Don't ever discount all the things you do that are helping. You know, I heard somebody years ago say it could be a lot worse than it is now if it wasn't for all of us doing what we do all over the world. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. So we're obviously not winning, but we might be slowing them down more than we realize. So Keep it
And
up.
we're keeping a candle alive. We're keeping a candle burning, candle of truth. And as long as that candle is burning, we haven't lost.
And
So,
a vision for what a real, like the video that Ellen played in the beginning, a beautiful
right.
vision for the
Yeah.
future. All right. Good night,
Okay.
everybody.
Night, Bruce.
Good night,
Thank you.
Bruce.
Thank you.
Rachel is still applauding. She hasn't stopped.